Hey everybody, Eric here. Recently, I had the great pleasure of spending some time with Tyler Pederson, who's the master distiller over at Westland Distillery. And Tyler walked me through a process called the hot steep sensory analysis, which is essentially how American single malt producers and other folks who use barley, like brewers, for example, will test the samples that are sent to them by malt houses who then want them to use these barleys in their fermentations and distillations. It might seem a little niche at first, but if you think about it, one of the best ways to understand spirits and learn what's really going on at the level of flavor is to get really familiar with the raw ingredients, the agricultural inputs. But that's just not something that folks outside of the industry really get to do. That's why I wanted to record the whole process here from start to finish and put it out for you to learn. Let's start with having Tyler actually explain what the hot steep sensory analysis is and entails.
So what you're doing is you take your malted barley and you grind it down, roughly mimicking the same grind profile that you would have for your mashing conditions, and then you add hot water and make a barley tea, and you filter that through a fine filter, and essentially, because we're using water at 65 degrees Celsius. Sorry, I'm going to use Celsius. It's just a habit of all of our brewing equipment being made in Canada. Um, 65 degrees Celsius, you add the water to that grain, and it's not going to fully convert all of the starches within that grain. So you're not making all of the sugars available to kind of coat your palate and your tongue, and which would roughly skew your flavor perception of some of these other nuanced aromatics. And so at 65 degrees C, you can get a nice extract without converting too much of those starches to sugars.
The fine folks over at Westland sent me 3 different malts. They sent me the Fritz, the AAC Connect, and another malt called Genie, all nicely milled. So the first thing I did was gather my materials. You'll see in the background several mason jars, which is where the hot steep was going to take place. I boiled up some water and just wanted to get a sense of where it stood. And that is way too hot, so I was going to need to let that cool. While the water cooled, I went about labeling everything, including the Glencairn glasses that I would use to test the samples. Here, we're using Glencairn glasses only for the whiskey samples, but it's important to have all your ducks in a row. When you do a structured tasting, the structure is there to help make sure that you're comparing apples to apples and that no other variables are going to confound your senses. Then I measured into each mason jar 25 grams of milled barley. This was roughly a half measure of what was stipulated in the instructions, but I also only used half of the water. As you see, we're very close here at 156 degrees Fahrenheit. So I spent the next several minutes measuring and stirring because I really didn't want to pour in water that was just a little bit too hot and, like Tyler mentioned, end up with kind of a sweet syrupy palate. Finally, got that magic number, 149 degrees. And at this point, I started pouring. Got all 3 mason jars filled as quickly and as accurately as I could. Got all the lids on there quickly so that they would cool at a constant level and the heat would stay relatively constant. And then I gave everything a really good shake so that all of the milled barley was completely saturated and there weren't any dry clumps floating around. Then I set a timer for 15 minutes and I waited. So you see I've got some larger mason jars now labeled up and ready to receive what we've got kind of sitting. We're gonna put one of these filters, kind of heavy duty lab grade coffee filters inside of each one of these. And if you wanna see what's going on here, we've got what looks like kind of like a layer of sludge. We got some light stuff floating on top. We got like a layer of goopiness. And then we've got the larger sediment in the bottom. So you can tell that the hot water really is acting on these, right? And I can't visually tell if there's any difference between these right now, but that's okay because we've done roughly, in fact, precisely the same thing to each one of them. They all receive the same temperature water, same amount of milled barley, and they're gonna sit for the same amount of time. So we're controlling our variables reasonably well here. This is what we're working with here at the end of 15 minutes. Kind of a goopy, sludgy layer, sediment and light stuff. So we're going to carefully filter this. Of course, it wouldn't be a true experiment if something didn't go wrong. Carefully. Luckily, I was able to recover. And once I figured out a way to get the coffee filters to stay in place, I just let gravity do its work. What we're looking at is this. Got some drip action going on. And these are going to sit here and collect as we approach our interview. So in the end, here's what our little project has yielded. There's the Fritz, clearly darker than the AAC Connect and the Genie Malt. These two look pretty equivalent, but we are going to see what they look like when we taste them along with Tyler Pederson from Westland. To get a sense of the flavors and aromas that this hot steep test generated for the 3 malts we tested, definitely tune into my full interview with Tyler, which you can find on episode 283 of the Modern Bar Cart podcast, and, of course, over on our YouTube channel. I'm Eric Kozlik. Thanks for watching, and, as always, I hope that you drink responsibly and experiment boldly. Cheers.